Chapter 13. Battalions of Unwanted Babies, the Cause of War. In every nation of militaristic tendencies, we find the reactionaries demanding a higher and still higher birth rate. Their plea is, first, that great armies are needed to defend the country from its possible enemies. Second, that a huge population is required to assure the country its proper place among the powers of the world. At bottom, the two pleas are the same. As soon as the country becomes overpopulated, these reactionaries proclaim loudly its moral right to expand. They point to the huge population, which in the name of patriotism they have previously demanded should be brought into being. Again pleading patriotism, they declare that it is the moral right of the nation to take by force such room as it needs. Then comes war, usually against some nation supposed to be less well prepared than the aggressor. Diplomats make it their business to conceal the facts, and politicians violently denounce the politicians of other countries. There is a long beating of tom-toms by the press and all other agencies for influencing public opinion. Facts are distorted and lies invented until the common people cannot get at the truth. Yet when the war is over, if not before, we always find that a place in the sun, a path to the sea, a route to India, or something of the sort is at the bottom of these troubles. These are merely other names for expansion. The need of expansion is only another name for overpopulation. One supreme example is sufficient to drive home this truth. That the Great War, from the horror of which we are just beginning to emerge, had its source in overpopulation is too evident to be denied by any serious student of current history. For the past 100 years, most of the nations of Europe have been piling up terrific debts to humanity by the encouragement of unlimited numbers. The rulers of these nations, and their militarists, have constantly called upon the people to breed. Large populations meant more people to produce wealth, more people to pay taxes, more trade for the merchants, more soldiers to protect the wealth. But more people also meant need of greater food supplies, an urgent and natural need for expansion. As shown by C.V. Drysdale's famous War Map of Europe, the great conflict began among the high birth rate countries, Germany with its rate of 31.7, Austria-Hungary with 33.7 and 36.7 respectively, Russia with 45.4, Serbia with 38.6. Italy, with the 38.7, came in, as the world is now well informed, through the publication of secret treatises by the Soviet government of Russia, upon the promise of territory held by Austria. England, owing to her small home area, is cramped with her comparatively low birth rate of 26.3. France, among the belligerents, is conspicuous for her low birth rate of 19.9, but stood in the way of expansion of high birth rate Germany. Nearly all of the persistently neutral countries, Holland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland, have low birth rates, the average being a little over 26. Owing to the part Germany played in the war, a survey of her birth statistics is decidedly illuminating. The increase in the German birth rate up to 1876 was great. Though it began to decline then, the decline was not sufficient to offset the tremendous increase of the previous years. There were more millions to produce children, so while the average number of births per thousand was somewhat smaller, the net increase in population was still huge. From 41 million in 1871, the year the empire was founded, the German population grew to approximately 67 million in 1918. Meanwhile, her food supply increased only a very small percent. In 1910, Russia had a birth rate even higher than Germany's had ever been, a little less than 48 per thousand. When Tsarist Russia wanted an outlet to the Mediterranean by way of Constantinople, she was thinking of her increasing population. Germany was thinking of her increasing population when she spoke as with one voice of a place in the sun. For some decades, said the Royal Prussian Journal in an article quoted by the Malthusian of April 15, 1911, the great growth of German population has been almost entirely forced into the towns, since of the 4 millions of increase in 5 years, only a few could find places in agriculture, as most properties are too small to permit of letting off a portion. And as regards the larger farms, the tendency of modern, cheaper machine methods is rather to produce a saving of the more costly manual labor. For some time past, Germany has no longer been in the position of feeding her own population, and large quantities of food as raw materials have to be imported, for which exports have to be exchanged. It is doubtful whether even this can for long keep pace with the present rate of increase of population. There are other utterances which just as frankly acknowledge that, having produced surplus population, Germany proposed to procure by means of war the expansion necessary to care for it. Adeline Moore, in Uncontrolled Breeding, a study of the birth rate and its relation to war, quoted the Berliner Post. Can a great and rapidly growing nation like Germany always renounce all claims to further development or the expansion of its political power? The final settlement with France and England, the expansion of our colonial possessions in order to create new German homes for the overflow of our population, these are problems which must be faced in the near future. This was published in 1913. Just as frank was the recognition of the true cause of international conflicts by a number of British authorities. In Uncontrolled Breeding, the author quotes the British National Commission's report on the declining birth rate. The pressure of population in any country brings, as a chief historic consequence, overflows and migrations, not only for peaceful settlement, but for the conquest and for the subjugation and exploitation of weaker peoples. This always remains a chief cause of international disputes. The militaristic claim for Germany's right to new territory was simply a claim to the right of life and food for the German babies, the same right that a chick claims to burst its shell. If there had not been other millions of people claiming the same right, there would have been no war. But there were other millions. The German rulers and leaders pointed out the fact that expansion meant more business for German merchants, more work for German workmen, at better wages, and more opportunities for Germans abroad. They also pointed out that lack of expansion meant crowding and crushing at home, hard times, heavy burdens, lack of opportunity for Germans, and what not. In this way they gave the people of the empire a startling and true picture of what would happen from overcrowding. Once they realized the facts, the majority of Germans naturally welcomed the so-called war of defense. The argument was sound. Once the German mothers had submitted to the plea for overbreeding, it was inevitable that imperialistic Germany should make war. Once the battalions of unwanted babies came into existence, babies whom the mothers did not want, but which they bore as a patriotic duty, it was too late to avoid international conflict. The great crime of imperialistic Germany was its high birth rate. It has always been so. Behind all war has been the pressures of population. Historians, says Huxley, point to the greed and ambition of rulers, the reckless turbulence of the ruled, to the debasing effects of wealth and luxury, and to the devastating wars which have formed a great part of the occupation of mankind as the causes of the decay of states and the foundering of old civilizations, and thereby point their story with a moral. But beneath all this superficial turmoil lay the deep-seated impulse given by unlimited multiplication. Robert Thomas Malthus, formulator of the doctrine which bears his name, pointed out in the closing years of the 18th century the relation of overpopulation to war. He showed that mankind tends to increase faster than the food supply. He demonstrated that were it not for the more common diseases, for plague, famine, floods, and wars, human beings would crowd each other to such an extent that the misery of the world would be even greater than it is now. These he described as natural checks, pointing out that as long as no other checks are employed, such disasters are unavoidable. If we do not exercise sufficient judgment to regulate the birth rate, we encounter disease, starvation, and war. Both Darwin and John Stuart Mill recognized, by inference at least, the facts that so-called natural checks, and among them war, will operate if some sort of limitation is not employed. In his Origin of Species, Darwin says, "There is no exception to the rule that every organic being naturally increases at so high a rate, if not destroyed, that the earth would soon be covered by the progeny of a single pair." Elsewhere he observes that we do not permit helpless human beings to die off, but we create philanthropies and charities, build asylums and hospitals, and keep the medical profession busy preserving those who could not otherwise survive. John Stuart Mill, supporting the views of Malthus, speaks to exactly the same effect in regard to the multiplying power of organic beings, among them humanity. In other words, that countries become overpopulated and war is inevitable. It follows as daylight follows the sunrise. When Charles Bradlaugh and Mrs. Annie Besant were on trial in England in 1877 for publishing information concerning contraceptives, Mrs. Besant put the case bluntly to the court and the jury. "I have no doubt that if natural checks were allowed to operate right through the human as they do in the animal world, a better result would follow. Among the brutes, the weaker are driven to the wall, the diseased fall out in the race of life, the old brutes, when feeble or sickly, are killed. If men insisted that those who were sickly should be allowed to die without help of medicine or science, if those who are weak were put upon one side and crushed, if those who were old and useless were killed, if those who were not able of providing foods for themselves were allowed to starve, if all this were done, the struggle for existence among men would be as real as it is among brutes, and would doubtless result in the production of a higher race of men. But are you willing to do that, or to allow it to be done?" We are not willing to let it be done. Mother hearts cling to children, no matter how diseased, misshapen, and miserable. Sons and daughters hold fast to parents no matter how helpless. We do not allow the weak to depart, neither do we cease to bring more weak and helpless beings into the world. Among the dire results is war, which kills off not the weak and the helpless, but the strong and the fit. What shall be done? We have our choice of one of three policies. We may abandon our science and leave the weak and diseased to die, or kill them as the brutes do, or we may go on overpopulating the earth and have our famines and our wars while the earth exists. Or we can accept the third, sane, sensible, moral, and practicable plan of birth control. We can refuse to bring weak, the helpless, and the unwanted children into the world. We can refuse to overcrowd families, nations, and the earth. There are these ways to meet the situation, and only these three ways. The world will never abandon its preventive and curative science. It may be expected to elevate and extend it beyond our present imagination. The efforts to do away with famine and the opposition to war are growing by leaps and bounds. Upon these efforts are largely based our modern social revolutions. There remains only the third expedient, birth control, the real cure for war. This fact was called to the attention of the Peace Conference in Paris in 1919 by the Malthusian League, which adopted the following resolution at its annual general meeting in London in June of that same year. The Malthusian League desires to point out that the proposed scheme for the League of Nations has neglected to take account of the important questions of the pressure of population, which causes the great international economic competition and rivalry, and of the increase of population, which is put forward as a justification for claiming increase of territory. It therefore wishes to put on record its belief that the League of Nations will only be able to fulfill its aim when it adds a clause to the following effect: that each nation desiring to enter into the League of Nations shall pledge itself so to restrict its birth rate that its people shall be able to live in comfort in their own dominions without need for territorial expansion, and that it shall recognize that increase of population shall not justify a demand either for increase of territory or for the compulsion of other nations to admit its emigrants, so that when all nations in the League have shown their ability to live on their own resources without international rivalry, they will be in a position to fuse into an international federation, and territorial boundaries will then have little significance. As a matter of course, the Peace Conference paid no attention to the resolution, for as pointed out by Frank A. Vanderlip, the American financier, that conference not only ignored the economic factors of the world situation, but seemed unaware that Europe had produced more people than its fields could feed. So the resolution amounted to so much propaganda and nothing more. This remedy can be applied only by a woman, and she will apply it. She must and will see past the call of pretended patriotism and of glory of empire, and perceive what is true and what is false in these things. She will discover what base uses the militarist and the exploiter make of the idealism of peoples. Under the clamor of the press, permeating the ravings of the jingoes, she will hear the voice of Napoleon, the archetype of the militarist of all nations, calling for fodder for cannon. "Woman is given to us that she may bear children," said he. "Woman is our property, we are not hers. Because she produces children for us, we do not yield any to her. She is therefore our possession, as the fruit tree is that of the gardener." That is what the imperialist is thinking when he speaks of glory of the empire and the prestige of the nation. Every country has its appeal, its shibboleth ready for the lips of the imperialist. German rulers pointed to the comfort of the workers, to old age pensions, maternal benefits, and minimum wage regulations, and other material benefits when they wished to inspire soldiers for the fatherland. England's strongest argument, perhaps, was a certain phase of liberty which she guarantees her subjects, and the protection afforded them wherever they may go. France and the United States, too, have their appeals to the idealism of democracy, appeals which the politicians of both countries know well how to use, though the peoples of both lands are beginning to awake to the fact that their countries have been living on the glories of their revolutions and traditions, rather than the substance of actual freedom. Behind the boast of old age pensions, material benefits, and wage regulations, behind the bombast concerning liberty in this country and tyranny in that, behind all the slogans and shibboleths coined out of the ideals of the peoples for the uses of imperialism, woman must and will see the iron hand of that same imperialism, condemning women to breed and men to die for the will of the rulers. Upon woman the burden and the horrors of war are heaviest. Her heart is the hardest wrung when the husband or the son comes home to be buried or to live a shattered wreck. Upon her devolve the extra tasks of filling out the ranks of workers in the war industries, in addition to caring for the children and replenishing the war-diminished population. Hers is the crushing weight and the sickening of soul, and it is out of her womb that these things proceed. When she sees what lies behind the glory and the horror, the boasting and the burden, and gets the vision, the human perspective, she will end war. She will kill war by the simple process of starving it to death, for she will refuse longer to produce the human food upon which the monster feeds. End of section 14. Chapter 14. Woman and the New Morality. Upon the shoulders of the woman conscious of her freedom rests the responsibility of creating the new sex morality. The vital difference between a morality thus created by woman and the so-called morality of today is that the new standard will be based upon knowledge and freedom, while the old is founded upon ignorance and submission. What part will birth control play in bringing forth this new standard? What effect will its practice have upon woman's moral development? Will it lift her to heights that she has not yet achieved, and if so, how? Why is the question of morality always raised by the objector to birth control? All these questions must be answered if we are to get a true picture of the relation of the feminine spirit to morals. They can be best answered by considering first the source of our present standard of sex morals and the reasons why those standards are what they are, and second, the source and probable nature of the new morality. We get most of our notions of sex morality from the Christian Church, more particularly from the oldest existing Christian Church, known as the Roman Catholic. The Church has generally defined the moral woman as one who mates out of wedlock. Virtually, it lets it go at that. In its practical workings, there is nothing in the Church code of morals to protect the woman either from unwilling submission to the wishes of her husband, from undesired pregnancy, nor from any other of the outrages only too familiar to many married women. Nothing is said about the crime of bringing an unwanted child into the world, where it cannot be adequately cared for, and is therefore condemned to a life of misery. The Church's one point of insistence is upon the right of itself to legalize marriage, and to compel the women to submit to whatever such marriage may bring. It is true that there are remedies of divorce in the case of the state, but the Church has adhered strictly to the principle that marriage, once consummated, is indissoluble. Thus, in its operation, the Church's code of sex morals has nothing to do with the basic sex rights of the woman, but enforces, rather, the assumed property rights of the man to the body and the services of his wife. They are man-made codes. Their vital factor, as they apply to woman, is submission to the man. Closely associated with and underlying the principle of submission has been the doctrine that the sex life is in itself unclean. It follows, therefore, that all knowledge of the sex physiology or sex functions is also unclean and taboo. Upon this teaching has been founded woman's subjection by the Church, and largely through the influence of the Church, her subjection by the state to the needs of man. Let us see how these principles have affected the development of the present moral codes and some of their shifting standards. When we have finished this analysis, we shall know why objectors to birth control raise the morality question. The Church has sought to keep women ignorant upon the plea of keeping them pure. To this end, it has used the state as its moral policeman. Men have largely broken the grip of the ecclesiastics upon masculine education. The ban upon geology and astronomy, because they refute the biblical version of the creation of the world, are no longer effective. Medicine, biology, and the doctrine of evolution have won their way to recognition in spite of the united opposition of the clerics. So, too, has the right of women to go unveiled, to be educated, and to speak from public platforms, been asserted in spite of the condemnations of the Church, which denounced them as destructive of feminine purity. Only in sex matters has it succeeded in keeping the bugaboo alive. It clings to this last stronghold of ignorance, knowing that women, free from sexual domination, would produce a race spiritually free and strong enough to break the last of the bonds of intellectual darkness. It is within the marriage bonds, rather than outside them, that the greatest immorality of men has been perpetrated. Church and state, through their canons and their laws, have encouraged this immorality. It is here that the woman who is to win her way to the new morality will meet the most difficult part of her task of moral house-cleaning. In the days when the Church was striving for supremacy, when it needed single-minded preachers, proselytizers, and teachers, it fastened upon its people the idea that all sexual union, in marriage or out of it, is sinful. The idea colors the doctrines of the Church of Rome and many other Christian denominations to this hour. Marriage, even for the sake of children, was a carnal indulgence. In earlier times, as Principal Donaldson points out in the position of women among the early Christians, Footnote, Contemporary Review, 1889. It was held that the child was conceived in sin, and that as the result of the sex act, an unclean spirit had possession of it. This spirit can be removed only by baptism, and the Roman Catholic baptismal service even yet contains these words, Go out of him, thou unclean spirit, and give place unto the Holy Spirit. The Paraclete. In the intellectual development of Europe, John William Draper, speaking of the teaching of celibacy among the early forefathers, says, "The sinfulness of the marriage relation and the preeminent value of chastity followed from their principles. If it was objected to such practices that by their universal adoption the human species would soon be extinguished, and no man would remain to offer praises to God, these zealots, remembering the temptations from which they had escaped, with truth replied that there would always be sinners enough in the world to avoid that disaster, and that out of their evil work good would be brought. Saint Jerome offers us the pregnant reflection that though it may be marriage that fills the earth, it is virginity that replenishes heaven." The early church taught that there were enough children on earth. It needed missionaries more than it needed babies, and it impressed upon its followers the idea that the birth wails of the infant were a protest against being born into so sordid a world. Thus are we presented with one of the enormous inconsistencies of the church in sex matters. The teachings of the early fathers were effect the advocacy of an attempt to enforce birth control through absolute continence, while later it reverted, as it reverts today, to the Mosaic injunction to be fruitful and multiply. The very force of the sex urge in humanity compelled the church to abandon the teaching of celibacy for its general membership. Paul, who preferred to see Christians unmarried rather than married, had recognized the power of this force. In the 7th chapter of the first epistle to the Corinthians, according to the Douay translation of the Vulgate, which is accepted by the Church of Rome, he said, verse 8, "But I say unto you, the unmarried and the widows, it is good if they continue even as I. But if they do not contain themselves, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to be burnt." When the church became a political power rather than a strictly religious institution, it needed a high birth rate to provide laymen to support its increasingly expensive organization. It then began to exploit the sex force for its own interest. It reversed its position in regard to children. It encouraged marriage under its own control and exhorted women to bear as many children as possible. The world was just as sordid, and the birth wails of the infants were just as piteous, but the needs of the hierarchy had changed. So it modified the standard of sex morality to suit its own requirements. Marriage now became a sacrament. Shrewd in changing its general policy from celibacy to marriage, the church was equally shrewd in perpetuating the doctrine of woman's subjection for its own interest. That doctrine was emphatically stated in the 3rd chapter of the 1st epistle of Peter and the 5th chapter of Paul's epistle to the Ephesians. In the Douay version of the latter, we find this, verses 22 through 24. "Let women be subject to their husbands as to the Lord, because the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. Therefore, as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their husbands in all things." These doctrines, together with the teaching that sex life is in itself unclean, form the basis of morality as fixed by the Roman Church. Nor does the St. James version of the Bible, generally used by Protestant churches today, differ greatly in these particulars from the accepted Roman Catholic version, as a comparison will show. If Christianity turned the clock of general progress back 1,000 years, it turned back the clock 2,000 years for woman. Its greatest outrage upon her was to forbid her to control the function of motherhood under any circumstances, thus limiting her life's work to bringing forth and rearing children. Coincident with this, the churchmen deprived her of her place in and before the courts, in the schools, in literature, art, and society. They shut from her heart and her mind the knowledge of her love life and her reproductive functions, to change her to a position into which they had thrust her, so that it is only after centuries of effort that she is even beginning to regain what was wrested from her. Christianity has no favorable effect upon women, says Donaldson, but tended to lower their character and contract the range of their activity. At the time when Christianity dawned upon the world, women had attained great freedom, power, and influence in the Roman Empire. Tradition was in favor of restriction, but by a concurrence of circumstances, women had been liberated from the enslaving fetters of the old legal forms. They enjoyed freedom of intercourse in society. They walked in the public thoroughfares with veils that did not hide their faces. They dined in the company of men. They studied literature and philosophy. They took part in political movements. They were allowed to defend their own law cases if they liked, and they helped their husbands in the government of provinces and the writing of books. And again, one would have imagined that Christianity would have favored the extension of women's freedom. In a very short time women are seen only in 2 capacities, as martyrs and deaconesses, or nuns. Now what the early Christians did was to strike the male out of the definition of man, and human being out of the definition of woman. Man was a human being made to serve the highest and most noblest purposes. Woman was a female made to serve only one. Thus the position attained by women of Greece and Rome through the exercise of family limitation, and in a considerable degree of voluntary motherhood, was swept away by the rising tide of Christianity. It would seem that this pernicious result was premeditated, and that from the very early days of Christianity there were among the hierarchy those who recognized the creative power of the feminine spirit, the force of which they sought to turn to their own uses. Certain it is that the hierarchy created about the whole love life of woman an atmosphere of degradation. Fear and shame have stood as grim guardians against the gate of knowledge and constructive idealism. The sex life of woman has been clouded in darkness, restrictive, repressive, and morbid. Women have not had the opportunity to know themselves, nor have they been permitted to give play to their inner natures, that they might create a morality, practical, idealistic, and high for their own needs. On the other hand, church and state have forbidden women to have their legal mate, or to refuse to submit to the marital embrace, no matter how filthy, drunken, diseased, or otherwise repulsive the man might be, no matter how much of a crime it might be to bring to birth a child by him. Woman was and is condemned to a system under which the lawful rapes exceed the unlawful ones 1,000,000 to 1. She has had nothing to say as to whether she shall have strength sufficient to give a child a fair physical and mental start in life. She has had a little to do with determining whether her own body shall be wrecked by excessive childbearing. She has been adjured not to complain of the burden of caring for children she has not wanted. Only the married woman, who has been constantly loved by the most understanding and considerate of husbands, has escaped these horrors. Besides the wrongs done to woman in the marriage, those involved in promiscuity, infidelities, and rapes become inconsequential in nature and in number. Out of woman's inner nature, in rebellion against these conditions, is rising the new morality. Let it be realized that this creation of new sex ideals is a challenge to the church. Being a challenge to the church, it is also, in less degree, a challenge to the state. The woman who takes a fearless stand for the incoming sex ideals must expect to be assailed by reactionaries of every kind. Imperialists and exploiters will fight hardest in the open, but the ecclesiastic will fight longest in the dark. He understands the situation best of all. He best knows what reaction he has to fear from the morals of women who have attained liberty. For, be it repeated, the church has always known and feared the spiritual potentialities of women's freedom. And in this lies the answer to the question why the opponent of birth control raises the moral issue. Sex morals for women have been one-sided. They have been purely negative, inhibitory, and repressive. They have been fixed by agencies which have sought to keep women enslaved, which have been determined, even as they are now, to use women solely as an asset to the church, the state, and the man. Any means of freedom which will enable women to live and think for themselves first will be attacked as immoral by these selfish agencies. What effect will the practice of birth control have upon woman's moral development? As we have seen in other chapters, it will break her bonds. It will free her to understand the cravings and soul needs of herself and other women. It will enable her to develop her love nature separate from and independent of her maternal nature. It goes without saying that the woman whose children are desired, and are of such number that she can not only give them adequate care, but keep herself mentally and spiritually alive, as well as physically fit, can discharge her duties to her children much better than the overworked, broken, and querulous mother of a large and wanted family. Thus the way is open to her for a twofold development. First, through her own full, rounded life, and next, through her loving, unstrained, full-hearted relationship with her offspring. The bloom of mother love will have an opportunity to infuse itself into her soul, and make her indeed the fond, affectionate guardian of her offspring that sentiment now pictures her, but hard facts deny her the privilege of being. She will preserve also her love life with her mate in its ripening perfection. She will want children with a deeper passion, and will love them with a far greater love. In spite of the age-long teaching that sex life in itself is unclean, the world has been moving to a realization that a great love between a man and a woman is a holy thing, freighted with great possibilities for spiritual growth. The fear of unwanted children removed, the assurance that she will have a sufficient amount of time in which to develop her love life to its greatest beauty, with its comradeship in many fields, these will lift women by the very soaring quality of her innermost self to spiritual heights that few have attained. Then the coming of eagerly desired children will but enrich life in all of its avenues, rather than enslave and impoverish it as do unwanted ones today. What healthier grounds for the growth of sound morals could possibly exist in the ample spiritual life of the woman just depicted? Free to follow the feminine spirit which dwells in the sanctuary of her nature, she will in her daily life give expression to that high idealism which is the fruit of that spirit when it is unhampered and unviolated. The love for her mate will flower in beauty of deeds that are pure because they are the natural expression of her physical, mental, and spiritual being. The love for desired children will come to blossom in a spirituality that is high because it is free to reach the heights. The moral force of woman's nature will be unchained, and of its own dynamic power will uplift her to a plane unimagined by those holding fast to the old standards of church morality. Love is the greatest force of the universe. Freed of its bonds of submission and unwanted progeny, it will formulate and compel of its own nature observance to standards of purity far beyond the highest conception of the average moralist. The feminine spirit, animated by joy's triumphant love, will make its own high tenets of morality. Free womanhood, out of the depths of its rich experiences, will observe and comply with the inner demands of its being. The manner in which it learns to do this best may be said to be the moral law of woman's being. So in whatever words the new morality may ultimately be expressed, we can at least be sure that it will meet certain needs. First of all, it will meet the physical and psychic requirements of the woman herself, for she cannot adequately perform the feminine functions until these are met. Second, it will meet the needs of the child to be conceived in a love which is eager to bring forth a new life, to be brought into a home where love and harmony prevail, a home in which proper preparation has been made for its coming. This situation implies in turn a number of conditions. Foremost among them is woman's knowledge of her sexual nature, both in its physiology and its spiritual significance. She must not only know her own body, its care and its needs, but she must know the power of the sex force, its use, its abuse, as well as how to direct it for the benefit of the race. Thus she can transmit to her children an equipment that will enable them to break the bonds that have held humanity enslaved for ages. To achieve this she must have a knowledge of birth control. She must also assert and maintain her right to refuse the marital embrace, except when urged by her inner nature. The truth makes free. Viewed in its true aspect, the very beauty and wonder of the creative impulse will make evident its essential purity. We will then instinctively idealize and keep holy that physical spiritual expression which is the foundation of all human life, and in that conception of sex will the race be exalted. What can we hope from a morality that surrounds each physical union for the woman with an atmosphere of submission and shame? What can we say for a morality that leaves the husband at liberty to communicate to his wife a venereal disease? Subversion of the sex urge to ulterior purposes has dragged it to the level of the gutter. Recognition of its true nature and purpose must lift the race to spiritual freedom. Out of our increasing sex knowledge, we shall evolve new ideals of sex. These ideals will spring from the innermost needs of women. They will serve these needs and express them. They will be the foundation of a moral code that will tend to make fruitful the impulse which is the source, the soul, and the crowning glory of our sexual natures. When women have raised the standards of sex ideals and purged the human mind of its unclean conception of sex, the fountain of the race will have been cleansed. Mothers will bring forth in purity and in joy a race that is morally and spiritually free. Section 15. Chapter 15. Legislating Woman's Morals. One of the most important duties before those women who are demanding birth control as a means to a new race is the challenging of our so-called obscenity laws. This will be no easy undertaking. It is usually much easier to enact statutes than to revise them. Laws are seldom exactly what they seem, rarely what their advocates claim for them. The obscenity statutes are particularly deceptive. Enacted avowedly to protect society against the obscene and the lewd, they make no distinction between the scientific works of human emancipators like Forel and Ellis and printed matter such as they are ostensibly aimed at. Naturally enough, then, detectives and narrow-minded judges and prosecutors who would chuckle over pictures that would make a clean-minded woman shudder unite to suppress the scientific works and the birth control treatises which would enable women and men to attain higher physical, mental, moral, and spiritual standards. Woman, bent upon her freedom and seeking to make a better world, will not permit the indecent and unclean forces of reaction to mask themselves forever behind the plea that it is necessary to keep her in ignorance to preserve her purity. In the birth control movement, she has already begun to fight for her right to have, without legal interference, all knowledge pertaining to her sex nature. This is the third and most important of the epoch-making battles for general liberty upon American soil. It is most important because it is to purify the very fountain of the race and make the race completely free. The first and most dramatic of the three great struggles for liberty reached its apex, as we know, in the American Revolution. It had for its object the right to hold such political beliefs as one might choose, and to act in accordance with those beliefs. If this political freedom is now lost to us, it is because we did not hold strongly enough to those liberties fought for by our forefathers. Nearly 100 years after the Revolution, the battle for the religious liberty came to a climax in the career of Robert G. Ingersoll. His championship of the much vaunted and little exercised freedom of religious opinion swept the blasphemy laws into the lumber room of outworn tyrannies. Those yet remaining upon the statute books are invoked but rarely, and then the effort to enforce them is ridiculous. Within a few years, the tragic combination of false moral standards and infamous obscenity laws will be as ridiculous in the public mind as are the now all but forgotten blasphemy laws. If the obscenity laws are not radically revised or repealed, few reactionaries will dare to face the public derision that will greet their attempts to use them to stay women's progress. The French have a saying concerning mort main, the dead hand. This hand of the past reaches up into the present to smother the rising flame of modern ideals, to reforge our chains when we have broken them, to arrest progress. It is the hand of such as have lived on earth but have not loved humanity. At the call of those who fear progress and freedom, it rises from the gloom of forgotten things to oppress the living. It is the dead hand that holds imprisoned within the obscenity laws all direct information concerning birth control. It is the dead hand that thus compels millions of American women to remain in the bondage of maternity. Previous to the year 1868, the obscenity laws of the various states in the Union contained no specific prohibition of information concerning contraceptives. In that year, however, the General Assembly of New York passed an act which specifically included the subject of contraceptives. The act made it exactly as great an offense to give such information as to exhibit the sort of pictures and writings at which the legislation was ostensibly aimed. In 1873, the late Anthony Comstock, who, with a list of contributors, most of whom did not realize the real effects of his work, constituted the so-called Society for Suppression of Vice, succeeded in obtaining the passage of the Federal Obscenity Act. This act was presented as one to prevent the circulation of pornographic literature and pictures among school children. As such, it was rushed through with 260 other acts in the closing hours of Congress. This act made it a crime to use the mails to convey contraceptives or information concerning contraceptives. Other acts later made the original law applicable to express companies and other common carriers, as well as to the mails. With this precedent established, a precedent which a majority of the congressmen could hardly have understood because of the hasty passage of the act, Comstock secured the enactment of state laws to the same effect. Meanwhile, the provisions regarding contraceptives had been dropped from the amended New York State Law of 1872. In 1873, however, a new section, said to have been drafted by Comstock himself, was substituted for the one enacted in 1872, and that section is essentially the substance of the present law. None of these acts made it an offense to prevent conception. All of them provided punishment for anyone disseminating information concerning the prevention of conception. In the federal statutes, the maximum penalties were fixed at a fine of $5,000 or 5 years imprisonment, or both. The usual maximum penalty under a state law is a fine of $1,000 or 1 year imprisonment, or both. Comstock has passed out of public notice. His body has been entombed, but the evil that he did lives after him. His dead hand still reaches forth to keep the subject of prevention of conception where he placed it, in the same legal category with things unclean and vile. 40 years ago the laws were changed and the chief work of Comstock's life accomplished. Those laws still live, legal monuments to ignorance and to oppression. Through those laws reaches the dead hand to bring the operating table each year hundreds of thousands of women who undergo the agony of abortion. Each year this hand reaches out to compel the birth of hundreds of thousands of infants who must die before they are 12 months old. Like many laws upon our statute books, these are being persistently and intelligently violated. Few members of the well-to-do and wealthy classes think for a single moment of obeying them. They limit their families to 1, 2, or 3 well-cared-for children. Usually the prosecutor who presents the case against a birth control advocate, trapped by a detective hired by the Comstock Society, has no children at all or a small family. The family of the judge who passes upon the case is likely to be smaller still. The words, "It is the law," sums it all up for these officials when they pass sentence in court. But these words, so magical to the official mind, have no weight when these same officials are adjusting their own private lives. They then obey the higher laws of their own beings. They break the obsolete statutes for themselves while enforcing them for others. This is not the situation with the poor people of the United States, however. Millions of them know nothing of reliable contraceptives. When women of the impoverished strata of society do not break these laws against contraceptives, They violate those laws of their inner beings which tell them not to bring children into the world to live in want, disease, and general misery. They break the first law of nature, which is that of self-preservation. Bound by false morals, enchained by false conceptions of religion, hindered by false laws, they endure until the pressures become so great that morals, religion, and laws alike fail to restrain them. Then they, for a brief respite, resort to the surgeon's instruments. For many years, the semi-official witch-hunting of the Comstock organization had a remarkable and deadly effect. Everyone, whether it was a novelist, essayist, publicist, propagandist, and artist, who sought to throw definite light upon the forbidden subject of sex, or upon family limitation, was prosecuted if detected. Among the many books suppressed were works by physicians designed to warn young men and women away from the pitfalls of venereal disease and sexual errors. The darkness that surrounded the whole field of sex was made as complete as possible. Since then, the feeling of the awakened woman of America has been intensified. The rapidity with which women are going into industry, the increasing hardship and poverty of the lower strata of society, the arousing of public conscience, have all operated to give force and volume to the demand for a woman's right to control her own body, that she may work out her own salvation. Those who believe in strictly legal measures, as well as those who believe both in legal measures and in open defiance of these brutal and unjust laws, are demanding amendments to the obscenity statutes, which shall remove information concerning contraceptives from its present classification among things filthy and obscene. An amendment typical of those offered is that drawn up for the New York statutes under the direction of Samuel McClure Lindsay of Columbia University. The words and sentences in italics are those which it is proposed to add. Section 1145. Physician's instruments and information. An article or instrument used or applied by physicians lawfully practicing or by their direction or prescription for the cure or prevention of disease is not an article of indecent or immoral nature or use within this article. The supplying of such articles to such physicians or by their direction or prescription is not an offense under this article. The giving by a duly licensed physician or registered nurse lawfully practicing of information or advice in regard to or the supplying to any person of any article or medicine for the prevention of conception is not a violation of any provision of this article. This proposed amendment should without doubt include midwives as well as nurses. There are thousands of women who never see a nurse or a physician. Under this section, even as it now stands, physicians have a right to prescribe contraceptives, but few of them have claimed that right or have even known that it has existed. It does exist, however, and was specifically declared by the New York State Court of Appeals, as we shall see when we consider that court's opinion in the Sanger case, farther on in the book. It can do no harm to make the intent of the law as regards physicians plainer, and it would be an immense step forward to include nurses and midwives in the section. With this addition, it would remove one of the most serious obstacles to the freedom and advancement of American womanhood. Every woman interested in the welfare of women in general should make it her business to agitate for such a change in the obscenity laws. The above provision would take care of the case of woman who is ill, or who is plainly about to become ill, but it does not take care of the vast body of women who have not yet ruined their health by childbearing, and who are not yet suffering from diseases complicated by pregnancy. If this amendment had been attached to the laws in all the states, there would still remain much to be done. Shall we go on indefinitely driving the now healthy mother of 2 children into the hands of the abortionist, where she goes in preference to constant ill health, overwork, and the witnessing of dying and starving babies? It is each woman's duty to herself and to society to hasten the repeal of all laws against the communication of birth control information. Now that she has the vote, she should use her political influence to strike, first of all, at these restrictive statutes. It is not to her credit that a district attorney, arguing against a birth control advocate, is able to show that women have made no effort to wipe out such laws in states where they have had the ballot for years. It is time that women assert themselves upon the fundamental right, and the first and best use that they can make of this ballot is in this direction. These laws were made by men, and have been instruments of martyrdom and death for unnumbered thousands of women. Women now have the opportunity to sweep them into the trash heap. They will do it at once unless, like men, they use the ballot for those political honors which many years of experience have taught men to be hollow. It is only a question of how long it will take women to make up their minds to this result. The laws of women's being is stronger than any statute, and the man-made law must sooner or later give way to it. Man has not protected woman in matters most vital to her, But she is awaking and will sooner or later realize this and assert herself. If she acts en masse now, it will be another cheering evidence that she is moving consciously toward her goal. End of section 16.